Hello everyone and welcome back to Reinventing Real Estate. I'm Jenna Harris, Head of Co-Living at Harris Associates, and today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by James Hunt, who is the Global Head of Real Estate at GSA, where he's played a pivotal role in the rapid expansion of this incredibly ambitious business, who now own and invest in over 40,000 beds globally. So incredibly impressive, and has also had kind of 2 decades of experience within the space, hasn't only kind of witnessed but also shaped the evolution of this sector. And that's why we're kind of incredibly excited to kind of get under the skin of everything that's been, happening in student housing pre-GSA and with GSA. What's really nice and where we love to start is around your kind of personal journey. But I do think before we get into that, it'd be really nice to hear from your perspective, who are GSA as a business? What's your kind of mission within the space?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me here today. And it's a really good opening question, one that I must think about briefly. But I think the point there is we can take our learnings from pioneering in the UK, adopt and apply those learnings to other countries, and we think we can make a difference in terms of what we can achieve for the people we work with in terms of investors around a global portfolio or portfolios that are of the best quality in the best higher education centres and the kind of real estate that you just don't want to sell. You want to own it forever because the quality is so high and it can't be replaced. Naturally, that is not something we're going to achieve in 1 year. It's a multi-year journey. We're 10 years young, but, they've been pretty tough 10 years. But, bringing those learnings, achieving a global portfolio of absolute scale and quality, that's kind of our mission. And we're on the journey, we're on the road, but there's a few more miles to clock up.
Fantastic. And then I suppose, going more into your kind of personal journey, what initially drew you to student housing, and what's kept you really engaged and passionate about it over the years?
I'd love to tell you I had a perfect 10-year plan, broken down year by year, milestones, all set out in a Gantt chart, but it was far more organic than that and opportunistic. So I was working in Bristol for a property consultancy, leasing office space. Quite good fun, but not that cerebrally challenging. And a guy I worked with joined Unite. This was back in 2000 actually. And on his way out the door said, James, give me a call. We'll be looking to recruit and it'll be development, if you're interested, kind of thing. Back then I knew nothing about development. I know slightly more now, but, only enough to be dangerous still. And that was great because joining Unite in January 2001 even, a pretty fledgling business, albeit it was a PLC. Basically, I was chucked a set of car keys and told, go and find some sites and given a patch of the Midlands. And it was literally a case of making up as you go along in terms of where are the locations students want to live. This was a time when you didn't walk around the city centre and go, oh, there's X, Y, Z and whoever, this is the pitch. I could walk around Leicester and there was one purpose-built building and that was it. And so you had to figure it out for yourself. And the beauty of that was there wasn't really a textbook of you do X, Y, and Z. Instead, it was a case of getting stuck in and working stuff out. And that's not to say we didn't have a bunch of professional, well-qualified, well-versed property professionals in the business, but it was pretty embryonic. And that was great because it was a sort of pioneering state. Very happy times. But it was really opportunistic in terms of I wanted to do development, and there was this mysterious thing called student accommodation that looked reasonably interesting.
What was the feeling at Unite at that time? I mean, obviously 2001, quite a long time ago, and as you say, it's reasonably embryonic. You're going across the country, you're having to kind of chart your own course, so to speak, in locations all over the UK. When you were part of that journey, what were you feeling? What was the kind of dynamic? How was it looking? Was there a real strategy or plan, or was it very much fly by the seat of our pants, let's go, let's kind of make this business a bigger entity?
So there was a definite theme to the growth, and there was a strategy. Was it as precise as it may have been? Well, no, but in a way, the distinction between City X and Y was less defined back then. you just simply had a excess of students needing accommodation. This was back in the tail of, back in the days of change of government, Tony Blair, 50% of school leavers going into higher education. Universities not keeping pace with that in terms of their supply of accommodation, and the private sector needed to do something about it, and that was the opportunity. So, of course, you could get it wrong in terms of the location in the city, but equally it was pretty easy to get it right as long as the scheme was sensible and it was viable and so on. In terms of the culture, the atmosphere, what was the feeling? Lots of growing pains, but also tremendous optimism. Tons of challenges, but being part of something where there was, massive growth. Just, being able to see that you're creating something, that was really interesting. And back to the point around what sort of keeps me interested in student accommodation. Pretty blessed in terms of the variety of different countries and cities in which we're present, together then with adding new countries and cities. And I just love the challenge that brings, because it's not as if everyone's done it and you're just, a cog in a machine. We're creating something. The joy of walking around a city X years down the line and going, okay, I was a part of that, or that was my idea, or, a team that I work with, created that, and this has had a really beneficial impact upon the lives of the students who are living there, with access to better accommodation than they would have had otherwise. That's
really powerful, isn't it?
It gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And being part of something like Unite and obviously now GSA, where two really ambitious businesses that are expanding drastically across the UK and obviously overseas in the case of GSA. But it's interesting to hear that from your perspective of being involved so early on, because, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are starting their own development businesses, they're starting their own investment management companies, they're starting their own private equity funds. What was it in those first few years at Unite, and then I suppose latterly GSA, that you felt were the real secret sauces or key ingredients to get that, success moving and get the wheels really turning to build that momentum?
I think one of the first points now I go back to Unite days, being able to sort of ride the crest of growth. And by that, what I mean is maintaining momentum even when you had challenges was really important. And that's a sort of mindset that we still hold true to ourselves today. In life, things do not go well every day of the week. There will be problems. Some of them will be massive. There will be challenges. There will be times when you think this is impossible. But that shouldn't then stop or get in the way of still wishing to grow, to expand and push things on and improve. Because if you just press pause to solve today's problems, like you'll never get anywhere. And so just finding that balance between measured, pragmatic, disciplined growth, whilst also refining the model and the approach to what you've already got, is a really important sort of facet to that. And, that would be something that I'd always say to people if they're on that growth journey in whatever business it might be. You've just got to be aware that it's hard yards to create something and keep optimistic. Otherwise, you'd just be dragged down.
That's a really nice one, I think, because it really seems as though you've kept that almost like startup mindset while scaling, which I think is probably a really difficult thing to do. And just maintaining that faith in, we're creating something really powerful here, and we're going to continue to do so. But as you say, every day is not the same, and with every success there are new challenges, and I think that's a really nice message for people, actually, because I think what people don't realise is, in order to get, and I think we find that in our business, you don't have to go to a new business to have a startup mentality and have a growth mentality. I think that's incredibly unique for a business that's obviously grown to your size. But I think it was really nice to kind of talk outside about the evolution of student housing, but also and you highlighted kind of perfectly, some of the elements that perhaps haven't actually evolved as much. And I think people always focus on, amenities and what's evolved, but you made a really nice point. I think it'd be nice to kind of come back to that on where you kind of see what you see student housing as today and where you see it in the future.
So there's a few points there. So if you think about the basic configuration, the model, certainly from a UK context, the look and feel, the level of amenity, the quality has evolved over time. And I think we can be proud around the quality of the offering. But the true innovation in terms of shaking it up hasn't really changed as it could, perhaps. And this is a really tough one. So the number of times you will go to a conference and there will be a panel session talking about affordability in student housing. Well, to build a brand new building in today's world, it's really expensive. So I can think back to the early 2000s, and the all-in cost back then was less than the cost of the land would be now per bed in a typical regional city. So you used to do stuff in the range of, 30, 40 grand a bed all in, and you'll typically pay that in a strong city now for the land. Well, to innovate and to come up with a different configuration would mean to break the mould and take some risk. The challenge, though, we have in the UK is planning, and this isn't just to try and beat up on planning, but it becomes so prescriptive and restrictive that it means everyone is really building the same thing. And I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity when it comes to increasing housing supply and choice and doing something about the fact that the UK is subject to an increase in the number of people living in cities, an increase in the number of students, which is a good thing because it's success and it's an educated workforce for UK PLC, but bluntly enough, housing is not being built. And the solution is not simply to impose restrictions and an affordable quota of, X will be that certain rent or whatever, but it's to try and innovate, have the private sector working with universities and working with the public sector and policymakers to find ways to increase viability, get Britain building and increase supply. And that can only be a good thing. If I can contrast that, though, to what we see overseas in some markets, and Japan would be the best example, we're present in Tokyo with 2 projects, 2 schemes up and running for quite a few years now. A tremendously challenging market, very, very high values, very high barriers to entry, but 1 million students. So massive market. And the first scheme we did there, which I think opened in about 19, Hakkasan House, 364 beds or bed or spaces, should we say. Really innovative. You have 6 people in a 36 square metre or 360 feet, roughly in old money for any of your listeners that also have grey hair like me, sort of living pod. And this comprises a central sort of kitchen area, living space, then 3 sort of bedroom pods adjacent or around that living space with a upper bed and a lower bed. But the beds are separate to one another and you can't see the person living above you the way it's designed on a sort of Jack and Jill basis, and then a shared bathroom.
Wow.
That's really interesting. Is that sort of like one of those pod hotels that they have in stations?
It's kind of, you could maybe say it's been inspired by that sort of innovation and challenge to create affordable accommodation, or quasi-affordable as in based upon the marketplace. Has that been a perfect model? Well, no, we've had to evolve that and we've learnt along the way. But putting a UK 5-bed cluster flat into that market would not have worked. It would not have been, you couldn't build it and lease it for the right rent to actually make any money. And so being able to take some of those learnings and the evolution of the approach from other countries and try and adopt that and evolve it for the local market is really interesting as long as the regulations allow.
Yeah.
So some of the inspiration from that project went into projects we've done in Australia where planning is a bit more open-minded, shall we say, in terms of what you do. Compare that, though, to the US, a nation blessed with land. Many of the universities are not in city centres. They're, more peripheral. And, we've got projects where you've got 800 rooms across 5-6 acres. Whereas in the UK, you probably build that on a, site the size of this table. And so would that model work over there? No. You've got walk-in wardrobes that would probably constitute a studio flat in, Zone 1 London. And so it's just fascinating, I find, to try and connect the dots in terms of how some of the learnings that we've got elsewhere about what does work and what doesn't work may be adapted. But closer to home, I just wish that we had the opportunity to innovate more so than we currently do, which is down to regulations.
I think it's really interesting because when you talk about innovation, I think having that vertically integrated structure like you do all the way down from the development side up to the operational side gives you the capability to be so much more innovative. Because I would say the problem when you're looking at innovation and affordability and all these key themes that we're talking about today from a capital and also from a developer perspective is you'll tour investors, as you know, around the affordable, which is what they sort of say originally in their investment thesis that they like the sound of. And then you'll take them to the highly amenitized third generation student housing. And ultimately, a lot of the time, because of investors' background, and maybe they're sitting in Mayfair, maybe they're sitting on Fifth Avenue, maybe they're sitting in Singapore, they gravitate more towards the premium product because they're more comfortable with that as, people in that sort of lifestyle and experience. So I think, when you've got that vertically integrated model, you're able to play with different styles and different typologies in a way that, capital will probably trust you and your vision and your background and your track record, whereas they might not do so for a standalone developer who are just creating, as you say, something that's slightly more cookie cutter or organised.
Indeed, but this is a way also we can point to what we've done in the UK previously, what we've done elsewhere, and there are actually examples which then can be translatable. So if I think about London back in period a year or so after the GFC, student housing was practically the only asset class that worked in the UK and in London. There were the odds and sods elsewhere. It was practically the only thing you could get funding for. You remember, before debt was practically free, banks were quite challenged when it came to actually lending money, which one could argue is their primary purpose, but never mind. And we did some amazing deals, but we broke London down into 3 zones. Zone 1, higher studio content, more of an international customer, obviously higher rents, and then, a traditional 5-bed sort of cluster flat model as well. Nothing was below, say, 225 a week in terms of rental levels. Zone 2 was more of a mass market offering, higher proportion of clusters, but still some studios, a mix of international and domestic students, pricing around £200 a week, say. But then we also innovated by going into Zone 3, so locations like Wembley, Tottenham Hale, Stratford, and you were able to deliver beds in those locations in the range of £150 to £180 a week. And that worked really well because you had a spread of price point, product, you could segment the market in terms of demand, and it meant there was something for everyone. And you may upsell a student, you may show them a studio room in Zone 1 and actually wasn't for them and they'd rather be in Zone 2 or whatever it might be. And knowing that will work and has worked consistently, we can take that logic and apply that elsewhere. So presently we're doing exactly the same thing in Rome. If you think about Rome, you've got a very, very constrained sort of central core, historic buildings. You're not going to do anything of scale there, but anything you can do will be like gold dust, and back to my point, you'll want to own it forever. So that's going to be your rarefied studio accommodation, the highest price point, probably predominantly international students. You'll then have your sort of Zone 2, and this is closer to where many of the universities are, still really well located, but it might be a 20-minute walk away. But compared to the traditional shared apartment sort of sector, it's a better location and much better quality accommodation. And we can deliver those rooms for probably a similar price point to those existing accommodation options. So I think really good value for money, and we'll outperform business plan. And then finally, we'll go a bit further out, still well located, still good transport links, still good amenity, but we will provide twin rooms, larger cluster sizes, smaller rooms, and get the price point down to €750 a month or below. And just, again, the ability to create a balanced portfolio, have 3,000-4,000 beds in that city over time, and emulate what we did in the UK 10, 15 years ago. Again, it gets me out of bed in the morning because we're not just going in with a homogenous product aimed at the same people, just taking a glitzy, shiny building from the UK and transplanting it and giving it a different name. And this comes back to just trying to approach things with a modicum of thought and consideration and not follow the crowd, pioneer and do our own thing, as it were, rather than just assume, the spreadsheet, spreadsheet never lies, spreadsheet's perfect, that's the thing to do, hike the rents up, because that's not what the market's about, really.
That's incredibly unique as well, having one business that's kind of owning all those different student experiences based on obviously accessibility and price point. Really interesting one that your own take on that is that, you don't want to be known for delivering one single product to the market, which, as you identify, many people's strategy, is, and yours is actually about owning the diversity of offerings within the market, which is, incredibly interesting, especially as well from like a data point of view as well, because you don't only have a view into a specific market within student housing, you actually have an umbrella view over what's going on with all the markets out of student accommodation.
Exactly. And if you take some of the parallels, say, with the hotel sector, you've got global brands who are massive. You know what you're getting in terms of quality. They may be your go-to if you're a Marriott person or whoever. And, it's a defined offering. They're in the right locations, the right cities, but then they have an array of different types of accommodation, and you can pick based on your budget or desire or whatever it might be. But again, that's what we're trying to create, both through the investment decisions GSA makes, but then working with Yugo, our sister business, who the property manager, on a global basis. And over time, what I think we will see in the sector is that same degree of brand recognition from the consumer will apply, where, so-and-so, a sibling or a friend or a relative, whatever, had a great experience with Yugo in, Austin, Texas. And they want, that the next generation or the friend of the sibling, etc., wants to also have that great experience with Yugo in, Rome or Adelaide or wherever it might be. And from the customer's perspective, knowing what they're getting, knowing the consistency of service, of quality, of amenity, the accommodation per se, is great for them. For an investor, having the name above the door that results in better rental growth, better occupancy, better customer satisfaction, what's not to like there. And then from a operating perspective, the ability to have scale at global, country, city level will result in efficiencies, centralized services, the overall scale, which will then, obviously improve margin, but also reduce OPEX costs. And this comes back to, this is not a 5-minute exercise, but that's really the aim, is to create that global brand, that global portfolio, and really project like the merits of the merits of the sector. And so just looking at it on that sort of global basis with that as the sort of mission is a thing quite different to if you are just implementing a country strategy. And there's nothing wrong with that, but of course, fewer, larger players may find that they have a very different outcome in due course based on the decisions they make today.
I think it's really interesting you talk about brand, because I think, again, at some of the conferences, people kind of pertain to brand, and yes, brand's important and everything else. I think, for us, when we look at the marketplace, we see brand being very front and center and becoming even more impactful when it comes to disposal processes, because ultimately, if you have got that unifying element and you've got that identity and you've seeded that sort of identity in the market over a period of time, then the capital that are going to be looking at these opportunities are ultimately have been conditioned to understand the value of those brands over a long time. So it might be the individuals, it might be the locations, the lifestyle, the experience, and the offer. And I think, that's why we created our sub-brand, which is Harris Studios, which is our own in-house marketing agency, because we felt like when it comes to the disposal process, it is so powerful that investors need to be brought into the lifestyle and the experience of student accommodation, but also obviously the other sectors that we deal with, in a way that I think hasn't been serviced in the agency market previously. And I think it's nice to hear from a different perspective how kind of B2C marketing is helping driving students who require that brand recognition and require that consistency of service to actually paying a premium in the rent or just being happier, providing better reviews.
Exactly. And whilst we may be blessed in most markets with an excess of supply versus demand, sorry, the other way around either, demand versus supply, it may not be that case forever. So, what would the landscape look like in 10 years' time? In the UK, for example, will we see a low number of 18-year-olds? Yeah, it will come off the current day highs. There's still a massive demand for accommodation. Back to my point about not enough houses being built to satisfy population growth. But when the market becomes more competitive, you need to stand for something in terms of your proposition. You can't simply rely upon the fact that more people need accommodation than there is accommodation available. And so just looking ahead to that, thinking about what you stand for, the consistency of service, and so on. Also thinking about university relationships, which we haven't really touched on yet, and building those relationships over time so that, if you need to diversify your sort of leasing strategy and have a higher weighting towards university nominations or leases, then actually you've got the relationship in place already. Again, this is just the sort of maturity of the sector beginning to come through. Is this, again, going to be overnight? No. Yugo's only been in existence for a couple of years. And that amalgamated 3 brands that were quite sort of disparate. And again, it's a journey, but we're beginning to get there and bear fruit from that. But yeah, I think the landscape in 10 years' time, in terms of the rise of a really limited number of global brands that actually lead to some defined better outcomes, will be the case. And quite a different landscape versus today.
So I think jumping back to the personal journey element, I think, you've gone through an experience at Unite in 2001. You've joined a really exciting, growing, ambitious business. And then you're at Unite for 17 years. So what's happening then, and why, after 17 years at being at, this rapidly expanding, very well-known industry leader, do you decide ultimately, I want to make a move and change and start something from scratch?
Yeah. So I think in life, it depends on your sort of level of ambition, I guess. And realising ambition doesn't always mean you're not taking risk. Obviously, you are taking risk, obviously. And I was at a sort of crossroads where it was, I knew what I was doing. It's reasonably steady state versus actually, do I want to open up the next chapter of my working life with a different challenge, which won't be easy, but maybe more fulfilling and satisfying? And from that, I mean a sort of job satisfaction rather than, monetary or whatever. That wasn't the key driver with it. And so the point there to basically working in an international business and go back to some of those more pioneering days from the start of my career as a student, that was really attractive to me. And again, just the variety. Of course, a smaller business, rapid growth, some of the systems, processes and so on, less defined. But again, that's where you can use your experience and wisdom and a bit of grey hair to improve things. And again, that's not always easy, but, you can make an impact. And this comes back to the satisfaction from you're not just a cog in a machine. And that's fine because many people, that's what they want out of life. But for me, I wanted something a bit more challenging, and I've not been disappointed since 2018 when I joined GSA because it's really challenging, but equally very satisfying as well.
So when you joined GSA, obviously it's sort of a new-ish business, and you're on this very strong upwards trajectory of building your own fund, which is Coral. I don't know if Coral was in existence at that time. Yes. And then you've got your operational expertise alongside that, and you've got your development expertise as well as your investment management side. And I suppose, what were the real critical decisions that as a group GSA took at that time to say, how do we get to where we want to go? And what were the kind of key decisions do you think that took GSA to the next level and really supercharged it? Because I can imagine, in a business like that, there's plenty of businesses that start out with really strong ambitions and say, I want to grow to X amount, but then it ultimately never happens. But what do you think were the ingredients that made that so successful and kind of get to today's growth?
So I think the biggest factor in that is the right risk calls. And that is not always easy by definition. So go back to February 2020. You'll recall there was quite a bit of press about the emergence of a virus that was vexing and worrying a lot of people for good reason. And at the same time, we put under offer a 8,000 bed portfolio in the US, together with agreeing terms to buy an operating platform. And I remember the flight back from the first meeting we had with the whole management team once the deal was agreed, when we were beginning to think about deal execution and transition and onboarding hundreds of people and so on. On the flight back from Denver, I watched a lady basically mopping down every surface that was in the vicinity of her seat with wet wipes. And then I land, get a newspaper at Heathrow, and I begin to see the furore around COVID. And it was, clear that this was serious. And taxi drivers like, I think this will be the last pickup I make from Heathrow for quite a while. Just like everything's going to grind to a halt. And fast forward a few weeks, we're thinking about, well, investing over 800 million into market entry, this feels quite risky currently. It was risky anyway in terms of the scale of it. But having the conviction that, higher education is not going to go out of fashion. Having the conviction that being in the US, a country with 19 million students, was the right place in terms of our global ambition. And also then ultimately acquiring that portfolio by the end of the year, and being in a world where we diversified our risk, because we had Australia at one end in terms of restrictions, and international students couldn't even travel into Oz, through to America, where sure there was some online learning and some modest impact in some cities, but by and large it was business as usual and people paying the rent, and it all worked out fine ultimately. But not many businesses would have kept going with that, doing a transatlantic deal, when to travel to the US you had to stop off in Dubai or somewhere else for 2 weeks because of the entry requirements into the US. So a visit to the US for 2 days would take you 16. Not many people would do that, but we did. And, we completed that deal, I think 5 a.m. the 24th of December 2020. I know because it was quite a long night, and that preceded about 4 months of very long nights. Having the conviction around the investment thesis. And today we have 18,000 beds there, a great partner in terms of our capital partner, a shared vision for the long term, and a lot of dry powder to expand the business and increase our 18,000 beds and 2.4 billion of AUM substantially in the coming years. But yeah, that was not an easy decision, but it was the right one, I believe.
Sounds really, a tough, but as you say, steadfast decision to stay by essentially what was your ultimate goal. And it seems like that's a lesson out of that kind of sort of story, so to speak, is if you are a founder or if you are pursuing some form of strategy, stick by what you think is the best course of action, even during challenging times, because, you rightly said, during these challenging times of COVID, ultimately that was a really smart investment decision that paid dividends eventually. And I think actually we're seeing a very similar strategy play out now.
We are, but also there are times when having the discipline to say no, and I can think of a situation a couple of years later when we were beginning to see inflation ramp. There was something in the water around interest rates as well, as in you could see that they were going to go up and potentially become quite expensive. And on a particular large portfolio, we spent months round the clock preparing to submit a final bid. Spent a lot of money on it, and I can still remember the debate at 5 o'clock on the Friday afternoon when the bid was due in by 5 p.m. And the very sage advice from our chairman, non-exec chairman, who tremendously experienced, ran GE Real Estate for many years and sold that business for about 40 billion. So he knows his onions, as it were. And the sage comment was, I think the only thing worse than losing this portfolio, as in not buying it, would be to buy it. Because he could see that actually we'd probably be paying more than we were comfortable with ultimately, and the changing landscape beneath our feet could be really risky. That's quite tough when you've been living and breathing something for a long time in terms of preparing something, and you're just like tunnel vision, we're bidding, we want to buy this. But ultimately, knowing when to divorce the emotion of, this is a deal we want to do, from the sort of more cerebral aspect of, is this the right thing now? that's really difficult. In some ways, that's more challenging because we try and go through life on an optimistic basis.
It's interesting the point, and it's interesting to put those 2 points together. But what I really liked about the point before about COVID was, I think it's a general lesson as well, just for the market. And a lot of what we've seen evolve is that there are these kind of knee-jerk reactions to, news that comes out, or, politics or geopolitics, that make people very nervous. And that almost overwhelms that mission statement, which I think is really powerful, that you kind of stuck to, which is, higher education isn't going anywhere. And that being almost like your grounding belief that got you through that. And I think people, as you say, obviously on a case-by-case basis, it needs to be adopted in the right way. But having more of that, and I think it comes with being at a more kind of entrepreneurial business, but having that foresight to say, actually, we just believe in what we do and we'll ride this storm.
And I can think back over the years to times when, be it a bank or an investor or whoever it might be, challenges you and says, well, there will always be demand for student accommodation. It's quite a set sort of product, and how do you reconfigure it if student demand falls away, whether the university closes, whatever. And then also the challenge was, you'd hear from people, well, what about the rise of MOOCs and massive online open courses, and just people sitting at home, don't need accommodation, as in rented accommodation, they'll sit with mum and dad and just do it online via the internet, blah, blah, blah. In a way, COVID was that experiment, because students did exactly that. And the number of conversations I had with people who have a son or daughter at university who were like, or they've gone back to wherever, they were living at home, even though all the coursework is online currently, they couldn't bear to be back in the house with mum and dad, and we couldn't bear it either. So they've gone back to Sheffield or Leeds or Manchester, wherever it might be, to live with their mates in a purpose-built building or a shared house, whatever it might be. And so that proved out the concept that students wish to be amongst students. They wish to be leading their lives independently, figuring stuff out for themselves, making relationships, whatever it might be, and the part that university plays in that. And so having that ability to demonstrate to people that actually the physical higher education sort of approach ain't going anywhere really ticks the box of that lasting demand and supports the business case for what we want to do for many, many years to come.
I think thinking about some of the capital that you work with, so you obviously work with some of the largest pension funds and private equity funds globally, including the likes of BlackRock, who are the world's largest asset manager. I think it would be really interesting to share some experiences of how you deal with these sort of large, really, really diverse in a lot of ways. I mean, I think people see these funds as monolithic, but it depends on the fund manager or the group that you're dealing with internally. But I think what would be lovely to understand from your perspective, the audience and the listeners that are looking at this is, how do I engage with people like that? And what are your experiences at GSA when dealing with the sources of capital, and how do you attract those capital into partnering with businesses like yours?
So many aspects to that, but first of all, what's your strategy? What's your vision? What are the thematics around investing in the sector and with you as a partner? And being absolutely clear in that regard and the conviction around the investment case. I then think that back to the point around scale, that can play a significant role in this. So we work with some funds who may be $40 billion plus and may want to make a relatively modest allocation to student, i.e. 10%, but it's still $4 billion. That's a lot of equity. Well, some of those players, they don't want to come into a new sector to them and do a 500 bed, 100 million, 200 million, whatever it might be deal. That doesn't really touch the sides. And so we found that some partners, when they've come into the sector, they wish to do so at scale. And there aren't that many people out there in terms of asset managers or other partners that will then be able to demonstrate the credentials and the track record and give comfort that writing a big check day one is going to be a safe thing to do. So it's that range from the business case, the understanding around the strategy for why to invest, together then with the nature of the people you invest with, the nature and scale of the real estate you invest into, and finally, good old-fashioned hard work around understanding the intricacies of the sector, of your real estate, of whatever it might be, inside out. Because these people will have an army of analysts who will be very data hungry. And that's right. They've got a fiduciary duty to their investors to get their decisions right. And so we have to respond to that. And so that's about the professionalisation of the sector, because back many, many years ago, it was, how can you justify the rent should be £70 a week? You know, that was quite a different question to answer versus some of the ones that we get in Q&A these days.
I think sort of interesting to hear that. And I suppose the question I would ask is, what do you think is so sticky about GSA that attracts all of these sources of capital all over the world in different jurisdictions, and also in jurisdictions where you might not have any sort of presence, but people are so confident in your abilities to go to new markets that they give large sums of capital to let you do that?
So to address the last point first, and again, I'll give Yugo as an example of that. So Yugo manages pretty much all of GSA's beds from a property management perspective. A couple that are managed by somebody else. It has also just bought CRM, so 27,000 bed plus portfolio across UK and various countries of mainland Europe. Where that's been interesting is that has given us insight into various countries we're not currently present in, together with cities we're not present in. And so just beginning to get that learning prior to making a physical investment is a really positive thing. And so that's kind of where the power of the group comes into play. The other point around partnering on a long-term basis, many reasons within that, but it would be easy to say, well, it's simply because we've done some smart deals and made people lots of money. And yes, that is true. Equally, though, how one reacts when there are challenges, when things go wrong, which naturally they do in life, and the decisions you make and how you stay true to a partnership, even if that may be quite challenging, doing the right thing for the relationship, people do not forget that. And so that long-term vision and valuing relationships on that basis, as opposed to just thinking about, well, what's the in-year impact, that's really, really important. So you've got to be a true partner ultimately.
Long-term thinking, I suppose, long-term thinking in relationships.
Absolutely.
I think going back to your point that you touched on a moment ago, which is the professionalism of the sector and having banks of analysts, and obviously we experience this and have to provide many layers of data and models and analysis to assist with fund decisions to ultimately purchase assets that we're selling. But it's interesting to hear your perspective on it, because a lot of funds and developers that we've spoken to seem to think that this is a really positive thing, as you say, but also comes with some negatives in, you know, what you said earlier, which is sometimes you just know, you know, you have a gut feeling, or there's a new location that you think is really going to work for student housing, but there's no data and analytics around that location at all because there's nothing there, like you mentioned about Rome. So what happens then? And do you think that that level of professionalism has sort of gone too far and the pendulum has swung that way? Or do you feel like it just needs to be thought of in a different way and maybe entrepreneurialism takes over?
Combination, really. And bizarrely, you find that the people in at the most senior level will be more instinctive around the thematics of the investment. And of course, there will be others in the organisation that need to have understood the detail and have been through the 15,000 questions they may ask you, or whatever it might be. But quite often you can be surprised at if someone shares that strategic vision, then actually that buy-in from the very top of the organisation may be less data hungry than you expect. There will be validation thereafter, but yeah, having that conviction over the thematics of, oh yeah, let's place a X check into someone's hands to expand into X country, sometimes you'd be surprised at how that differs versus the 15,000 emails on a Saturday morning from a person in the analyst team, etc. Do I think it is a negative though when people ask lots of questions? No. I think as long as people are asking the right questions, then they're entitled to do that, and they should be doing that.
I think ultimately people have to understand what they're buying, don't they? And they have to understand the strategy. But I think, like you said, when you're defining this Rome experience for GSA and you're defining what it's going to be like in lieu of the fact that there's nothing there at the moment, there is a leap of faith.
And I guess that comes back to a kind of judgment call on making a decision when you do not have perfect evidence. And if there are only 5 purpose-built buildings in Rome or whatever it is, then funnily enough, you do not have perfect evidence. But you can look at the experience in the UK, being one of the most mature sectors on the planet, and think through what the parallels are. So we did a very interesting exercise recently, just looking at rental growth in different cities over the last 20 years in the UK versus the rate of supply increases. And it was pretty instinctive, the results versus what you would have anticipated, but it was worthwhile to actually do it in an analytical manner. And unsurprisingly, that showed that cities like Sheffield, where supply has increased substantially, have seen lower rental growth, only a couple of % over a 10-year period. And then the cities with the highest constraints to supply, which also have experienced the highest increases in demand, and hence the true underlying provision rate may not have really changed over time, they've experienced higher rental growth. Basic supply demand, it doesn't take a genius to work this out. And that may be in the range of 5 to 10% on average. And that comes back to the point around policymakers seeing what we do as part of the solution rather than taking up land that should otherwise be used for residential use, say. If you want to do something around supply and pricing, well, building more is kind of the approach. Don't vilify the sector if not enough is being built and rents are going up higher than people may like. And so, again, that's something we think passionately about in terms of trying to use data, whether it's in a discussion with a policymaker or whether it's with an investor or whoever, and be able to base some stuff on fact so that even if you don't have perfect evidence in the marketplace that you're wishing to make a decision in, where can you take data from elsewhere that helps inform that? But then ultimately someone has to make a judgment call of, okay, on balance, do I buy into this story?
Interesting, that chicken and egg, isn't it? About kind of the rents driven up because there is not enough supply, but then there's this barrier to getting that supply through, and then this stigma attached to the rents being so high and how kind of cyclical, that is. It's kind of interesting to highlight that.
And this is just where I tear my hair out, what's left of it, because of a lack of kind of information, informed thinking and bluntly intellect with some of this stuff. So I read an article yesterday about a regional city where a new Green councillor was basically vilifying the student accommodation sector as forcing rents up, but also that was the reason why overall housing supply was less. So because beds had been built to satisfy an increase in student numbers, that was a bad thing. And it was quite a well-written article by a regional journalist actually analysing what was the population growth, what was normal, general housing supply increases, housing starts, etc. And it was demonstrable. It was nothing to do with there being more students and then, in turn, more student accommodation. These were underlying issues that no one had sorted, i.e. housing supply. And this is deeply frustrating that we can be 30-odd years into purpose-built in this country, and the same debate around freeing private rented accommodation through building purpose-built, that message is still not really landing. And ultimately, it's a two-way street. Have we messaged it in the right manner? Perhaps not. But you need to be talking to people that actually open their ears and will really get under the data and listen rather than just vilify someone else for a pre-existing condition.
Well, I think it's interesting because cities like Bristol, where you're obviously from, are cities where student accommodation supply is extremely limited, but also residential supply is limited.
Therein lies the point.
So, the land availability, whether it's in Bath, whether it's in Edinburgh, is limited on every single use cast possible. And you can't just turn to student housing and say, oh, you're building new student beds and therefore that's actually a negative to the residential sector, because actually you are housing people that would otherwise be in the residential sector in that city.
And what's the trade-off? So it's very easy in life to look at one issue in isolation and not think about the compromises one would have to accept to deal with that first issue. So do you want to build on the green belt? No. Do you want to build higher in historic city centres? No. Do you want to stop migration? No. You know, if you look at all of these different factors, then funnily enough, you're just creating greater barriers and you're not solving the problem. So ultimately, and I don't have the answer everywhere, but I know that there needs to be informed debates and be willing to accept trade-offs. So if we're actually, as long as the design's really high quality, an extra 4 stories, they're probably not going to make any difference. Sure, sight lines and historic buildings and so on need to be respected, but you don't walk around a city centre looking up all the time. You're more likely to be looking down in your phone, frankly. So, it probably won't make any difference to the streetscape. And if it's well designed, it can actually be a positive thing in terms of the quality of the built environment. But again, it's around people just being informed in that debate to come up with solutions. It frustrates me, but I think we can do our bit, shall we say? Do
you think there's space for companies like GSA who've got a lot of credibility and clout in the sector and also outside the sector? GSA, Unite, potentially Vita, and others of a similar ilk to come together to form something that's larger unto itself in order to lobby on behalf of the student housing sector. Because I think in residential sectors like BTR, they've got the ARL and the residential for sale sector, they've got various lobbying groups. Is that something that we should be doing as a sector?
Yeah, I think there's an alignment between many businesses, and there's the beginning of discussion to achieve that. And frankly, it's been too long in the making, and that can only be a good thing. And we end up getting quite defensive, but if you were to look back over 20, 30 years, if the sector hadn't emerged, what would be the state of housing and the challenges in these cities around the UK, and the same true with many other countries? It would be even more acute. So the recognition that we've significantly increased housing supply, choice, it's not just about the rarefied studio room at X per week. If you want to live in a first generation building, really well located, a more basic offering, a bit more dated, but exactly where a student wants to be, there is choice out there, and it's probably much better quality than many of the HMO options that exist. And so, it's easy for the headline grabbing of, rooms that are only suitable for international students at the highest price point, but that's not really the totality of the market, far from it. And as a sector, to have the courage to represent it in a more positive, balanced manner and not to take some of the criticism is something we can get better at, to just get our point across, because I think there is something to be proud of. The work providers do with universities around mental health, well-being, together then with the physical aspects of great places for people to study. Every building I ever walk around these days, I'll walk into a study space on the ground floor, first floor, whatever. It'll be full of people working hard, determined to get better outcomes in life based on the back of their studies. And the quality of the accommodation will help contribute to that by a great working environment. So there's more we can do, I agree.
I think it's a really good point as well, because, I was up in Leeds the last UK Reef, and I was speaking on behalf of a panel and talking a bit more about the community and social aspect of student housing. And someone put up their hand, and it was a member of the estates team at the University of Leeds, and she was asking, how can we partner together with private providers to enhance the experience for students across the board? And I think what's interesting about our sector, or investors that are coming into our sector, is often they feel like there's an adversarial relationship between the university provider or the university themselves or higher education institutions and the private sector, and we're sort of competing. But I think actually there's so much overlap, and obviously there's the partnership model, which is becoming much more prevalent, and you've got companies like UPP and others doing a really strong job of that. But I think what struck me about the question that she was asking was, how can we kind of use private spaces, and how can we pool our resources together to actually form something that utilises each other's strengths and maybe plugs each other's weaknesses to just make the student experience a better area.
Yeah, and I'm pretty positive about this, certainly in the UK, because it's well established. The depth of relationship that exists between many universities and the partners with which they work, and their true partnerships these days, as opposed to someone on a tactical basis simply leasing some rooms or nominating some rooms because they've got a shortfall in their supply, and how those teams then on the ground work together and naturally dealing with some of the challenges that exist when people live away from home for the first time is a really good thing. So again, promoting the value of that partnership is something that can be done better. There's something to be proud of. And again, if I think about the experience we've taken at the UK and how we apply that to different geographies, we find that in many countries, the notion of university partnership doesn't really exist. And, a direct let model works. Therefore, why would you? Why would you engage with the university? And that's so short-sighted. But equally, that's an opportunity. I'd much rather be investing the effort in those relationships, and if others choose not to, that's great, because that's competitive advantage in using our sort of learnings and experience to on a sound basis.
I think what's really interesting is kind of now looking at the next steps of the GSA journey. And what I'd love to do is if you could bring listeners into the room of you and the executive team sitting together, strategizing. What are the kind of key business planning elements that you're thinking to yourself, wow, we'd really like to do that, and this is our ambition now for the next 5 to 15 years? What are the kind of real excitement points that you're all working towards?
So there's a few things within this, and this is exactly what we've been doing over the last 12 months, be really clear about our 5-year plan and beyond. So first of all, it's interesting to look at what we're not going to do. So a common question is, go to a conference, what can purpose-built student accommodation learn from the living sector, from PRS or Build-to-Rent or whatever? And I'm thinking, well, probably only a limited amount, because in fairness, we're more mature, but also the desire for us to go into an adjacent living sector doesn't exist. And the reason for that is not a lack of ambition, but there is so much opportunity within our core market, which we know, it's in our DNA. You could slice us in two and it would say PBSA. That there's no need for us to do that. Instead, it's around the geographies that we go into. Equally, you could be really rash and undisciplined and try and be everywhere all at once. And that's something we've learned over time, to be disciplined in terms of where you invest so that you can put the right effort in to get the right outcomes is very important. So within that, we've broken the globe into 3 regions. They're quite big regions, being North America, Europe, and an APAC. And then the desire is to have capital relationships on a long-term basis in each of those markets with the right cost of capital, so we can do everything from kind of core plus investment, be it individual assets or portfolios, through to value add, repositioning of schemes, older projects that can be repurposed and so on, or convert a hotel into student, whatever it might be, through to then ground up development. And so the joy of that is we can bring all our skill and experience to bear. It means we can enjoy an array of product and price points, i.e. you build it from scratch, you know exactly what you're getting. It's a value add project. You can repurpose something that already exists, so it may be a low price point to begin with, through to straight investment assets. And then the further point there is from a depth of scale, but also depth of segmentation, product price point, you can be very varied. And this comes back to having relationships with universities in the best higher education cities on a global basis across those 3 regions, knowing that higher education won't go out of favour anytime soon. And if anything, when you look at the projections around significant increase in international students over time, and we know they're not the only customer, but they're a significant customer, those people need to be housed somewhere. And as competition for courses increases, those students will gravitate, plus domestic, the best quality higher education institutions, and that's where we can house them. So it's a pretty simple strategy: be in the right place and tailor to the right people, do it en masse, and do it with an array of product and price points. So we're not just one thing, we're diversified in terms of risk profile.
And I suppose of those 3 distinct geographical locations, what do you think are the most exciting locations for investment that you're looking at? Are there new and interesting locations that you think to yourself, wow, these are areas where we think the UK, but 20 years behind?
Absolutely. So, and it will differ according to the geography. So if I took the US or the UK, that may be more of a consolidation play around being in the right cities at the right scale, and so more towards the sort of core plus investment and with some development or value add, but perhaps more limited. If I then look at mainland Europe, it's very much the case of it's the UK 20 plus years ago. So if I'll give you the example and some of the stats on Rome. So you've got something like 250,000 students in Rome. So it's vast. Of those, there will be pretty high proportion live at home, or we believe will live at home. So you net it down being pretty pragmatic and, perhaps a worst case scenario, and it nets down to about 100,000 domestic, mobile and international. Then when you look at purpose-built and university beds, there's a whopping 9,000. Could you name a city in the UK that you'd actually like to be in with a 9% provision rate? I can't think of one. And so, it's not just the absolute scale of the market, but it's then that untapped opportunity. Now, obviously, these people are not homeless. They are living somewhere already, but it's a cottage industry when you look at the depth and quality of the existing choices. The pain point as well is significant for these people. And they're competing against, private residential tenants as well. And so, going back to the early days of the industry in the UK, the ability to see that untapped opportunity, but then approach it in a measured way, back to my point of not just going for the highest rent with a studio aimed at the international customer, etc. That parallel is really, really interesting. The final point I'll make is the sort of more pioneering. We can't be everything to everyone all at once. So that's where the discipline comes in. There are plenty of opportunities we see in South Africa or India or Mexico, all sorts of countries where there's a really interesting opportunity emerging, but it looks pretty risky currently. And so as a wider group, going in as operator will be the approach to really understand the marketplace and get to a level where there's a degree of maturity, you can go in at scale and you can figure out where the risks really lie and where the opportunities lie, as opposed to going too far up the risk curve. Because the nature of the people we work with in terms of capital, they'll be more cautious for good reason.
And that's an amazing test, isn't it? And, if you enter some of those more high-risk markets and actually find that through the operational experience, you're seeing something totally different, then in a positive way, then that's something that you can report back to the investors and say, I think there's a real opportunity here.
Absolutely. We're beginning to see some of these trends emerge. So the rise in Indian student numbers. So we talk about international students as this homogenous group. Well, we're far from it. And so some of the patterns we're seeing in terms of demand, price point, and the type of accommodation Indian students wish to live in is really fascinating. And so we're seeing an absolute depth of demand, but a more price-sensitive approach. Willing to trade off then on the kind of model, i.e. in a larger share, as in more bedrooms in a cluster, etc., or frankly favouring some of the older buildings that we have in our portfolio, as in less amenity, not as new and shiny, shall we say, as some of them, but still high quality living experiences. We've seen really sizable pickup in demand and leasing velocity. And that's across the globe. And so just beginning to see some of the changing patterns, not just in the absolute number of internationals, but the nature of the country of origin and what that then means in terms of the living experience people want. Again, you've got to scratch beneath the surface. It's not just a case of going, oh yeah, there's 30,000 internationals in that market, happy days.
Yeah, because as you say, it's about tailoring that experience and product effectively for the marketplace. Because as you rightly point to, the Chinese market in the UK is not performing as strongly as it once was, and the Indian market and the Nigerian market seem to be incredibly interesting now, and it's about pitching that product in a different way, and maybe it's not having the karaoke rooms anymore, it's having something else. But I think, you're at 40,000 beds now. that's obviously a very big number. But I can't imagine that's where you want to end.
And bizarrely, I'd probably challenge is that a very big number. In the context of others, it's pretty sizable. But in the context of market share and the opportunity that exists, it's absolutely minuscule. So for us, the impediment to how big we could be is not around demand and, the opportunity not existing. And not many sectors have the luxury of that. Instead, it's the ability to make informed decisions and the realisation of that and doing it in the right way. So over the next 5 years or so, the notion that we could be a business with 20 to 30 billion AUM as opposed to the 6 billion that we have today, it sounds fanciful. However, I think it's achievable. It won't be easy, but the ability to undertake large-scale transactions, multi-billion-dollar transactions of high-quality portfolios exists. The desire from capital partners to invest for the long term and being comfortable with that level of scale exists. It's then just around the enactment of that strategy and doing it in the right way to make the right judgment calls and being ultra-professional so that you're the custodian of the someone else's money ultimately, and you're investing wisely and you're making the right decisions. That's something we can do. And so even at that scale, 20, 30 billion and, 100,000 plus beds, well over 100,000, we're not that big really compared to the depth of opportunity. So I just think that the sector probably needs to think bigger than it currently does and be more ambitious.
I totally agree with that. And I think, what's interesting is in the UK, we're conditioned to think that there's certain sizes that one can get to. And I think people look at IQ and they look at Student Roost and they think, that's probably the limit to size or chapter. But actually, when you're looking in the context of the wider real estate industry globally, and you're looking at the US and some of the listed businesses that they have out there, actually, these sort of student housing platforms are, as you say, minuscule.
Yeah.
And that's where someone like yourselves with that global expertise and global experience can say, actually, we're not being quite as ambitious as a sector as we should be. And a property company like GSA can and will get to that sort of size and that sort of scale, but do so in a way that is responsible and sustainable and professional, because that's the foundation of the business that you guys have all built.
Absolutely. And then coming back to the point around personal journey and sort of what you want out of life, the ability to one day look back and go, we haven't cracked it, because of course you never do, as in there's always, you would hope, the ability to improve further or grow further or whatever it might be. But to achieve even 75% of what we're setting out to achieve would still be an amazing outcome. It would be a modicum of disappointment, of course, but it would still be pretty amazing. And so aligning one's horizons. The only thing that worries me, though, is life on Mars being discovered, because I know that I get a call from Nick Porter telling me that I need to be on the next space shuttle.
Is there a student market over there?
Yeah. So I think it'd be really nice to, given where you've got to in your career and the journey you've been on, what advice you would give to your younger self now, or I suppose anyone, looking to enter the real estate sector today?
I think acknowledging that a traditional path, and I came from a reasonably traditional path, as in I went and did a surveying degree, chartered surveyor, blah, 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 property, real estate, technical stuff. What I like now is that there are many different routes for people to get into the sector. And I think that's really good, because I think diversity of thought and challenge and it not being an echo chamber can be a really positive force for good in terms of the decisions people make and how they conduct themselves in their business. And so that would be something that I'd always encourage, as in, do not think that because you didn't do X, Y, and Z and you're not from whatever background that, real estate wouldn't be for you. It can be for absolutely everybody. The other thing in terms of what would I tell my younger self, well, it's really boring, but I'd just reinforce the point of keep your head down, work hard, listen, reflect on experience, but then know when to be bold around some of the decisions you make. They're just they're pretty boring things, but sometimes you'd be surprised in life that the obvious things are not what people do.
Yeah. I think also that diversity of thought point is such an interesting one, and I think one that we also challenge ourselves to do, at Harris Associates, is sometimes we have meetings and the actual purpose of the meeting is not to talk about anything related to real estate, and it's just, what inspired you this week? Are you reading a good book? Have you watched a good film? Have you seen a good documentary? Because I think inspiration is all around, but as you say, it's almost very easy to block out the noise, thinking that you can only be, really effective if you are got this kind of like tunnel vision. But actually, we find some of the best ideas that kind of get thrown around the room are from totally unrelated, sectors or, ideas. So I think that is a really amazing, piece of advice for people.
And where this resonates is deep down, there's a degree of laziness of thought in our brains teach us to sort of take shortcuts based upon, well, I did that in that experience previously, therefore I don't need to think too hard about it. That's just what I do. And what I like and encourage, and it's not always easy, is just a challenge. Well, why are we doing it like that? Oh, because we do. Is that right? And it's amazing how many things we do just by habit.
Yeah.
Whereas if you sat down and really challenged yourself with a blank sheet of paper and forgot everything you knew, which is quite difficult to do, obviously, and think about, well, what's the most effective way, or what's the decision, or what's the innovation, or whatever, you'd probably come out with quite different approaches than you would do without going through that exercise. So back to your point around how you take inspiration from a different sector or a different experience or whatever, and just trying to apply that without it sounding gimmicky, I think it's a really sensible, interesting approach to take. And, we talked earlier about, has the sector evolved in terms of configuration? Well, not quite as it should have or could have. Look at the management platform, the way we collectively as an industry manage buildings. Is there a way that can evolve? I'm sure there is. You have some cities where some rooms are pretty low priced due to market dynamics, but you have the same operating model and the same operating cost as a building that's leased for twice the rent. Does that make sense? Your margin's not very good. Well, someone needs to come along and shake the industry up and go, well, actually, should you be providing X, Y, and Z services? Is there a completely different model? I don't know what that looks like, but I'd say it just as an example of just saying, well, thou must do it this way because that's the way it's always been done is not the answer, I don't think.
Challenge the status quo.
Be nice, wouldn't it?
And then I'd love to ask you, I suppose, it can be either from a kind of personal perspective or a kind of business perspective or both. But if you had to kind of label or title this chapter in your life, what would you think is most relevant?
I'd kind of call it some like blood, sweat and tears, but with deep satisfaction. That sounds terrible, I know, but it's kind of embodies it because it's not easy.
It's true.
But the reality is if you can achieve some difficult things, the degree of satisfaction you derive from that. Because, we all love everything to be easy, but it kind of gets boring, doesn't it? You have to tell me because it's never easy. But anyway.
Don't think it is for anyone.
Yeah.
But I think, as you say, if you kind of work hard, put in the hard yards, so to speak, and then see the results of it, then that's what's ultimately so satisfying and so rewarding. And certainly from our perspective, when we're trying to innovate the agency sector and do something that's a bit different and, creating more marketing, more intrigue, more interest, and go about agency in a different way, I think, there's obviously those people that are reticent, but there's also the people that are saying to us and coming to us and saying, we really love what you're doing and we love the strategy you're pursuing and we want to be a part of it and we want to be part of the journey. And I think for us, getting that positive feedback and getting, even mentions or people referencing us in presentations that aren't ours, they're our competitors, are why we do it. And ultimately, we want to create a much better experience for our clients, because we feel that there's an opportunity now more than ever to, as Jen said, challenge the status quo and create something that is different, because ultimately there's no reason why we need to do things in the same way.
And presumably you're doing that because it means it's a different proposition, a different offering to what otherwise exists. So there's some diversity there. You're able to compete against others in probably an increasingly crowded marketplace in a different manner. It's probably good fun as well, isn't it?
It is good fun. We love the creative. But I think, ultimately we're doing it because we truly believe that it provides the best quality service and ultimately creates the best value for the client. And we get a better price.
And that point about value. So we've come off a period of time when debt was exceptionally low priced and has been consistently the case for many, many years. You've then seen clearly consistent rental growth and occupancy, and then yields have generally been on a downwards trajectory. So naturally values have gone up. Being in an environment now when you've got to create value and go back to alpha performance, and it's not just financial engineering, it's quite an interesting chapter, I think, that we're sort of, all reading now. But equally, this will be the thing that sets many people apart. Some people will do it really well. They'll adapt, they'll thrive, they'll make, the businesses they work for lots of money, and they'll get personal gain. And other people will be, well, I haven't got the rule book for this because I'm not used to it. Anyone that's only started work in 2012, say, the environment you've had through to 2022 is quite different 10 years compared to 2022 to 2032 is going to be. So this concept of creating value, I think, is a really interesting point to focus upon, rather than just be swept along by a rising market, because markets don't always rise.
No, and obviously, certain circumstances are done for certain reasons. And I think our view is that the flat PDF was made for a commercial sector, which had a 15-year lease to the government, and that was it. And there was not much to understand. But operational real estate is a very different ballgame. Yeah. And I think especially when you've got liquidity coming from offices, from logistics, from new geographies, as you've mentioned, you've got to be bringing people into that experience and that product and that lifestyle and that kind of 360 approach, because ultimately it's not just about the building, it's about the students or the co-living tenants or the residents of a BTR that are experiencing and living the buildings, because they're the consumer. But I think, for us, what we love to kind of talk about at the end of a podcast as well is, if you were giving advice or you were kind of advising or being a mentor to someone and their aspiration was to, say, enter the student housing market, what would that necessarily be if they wanted to join a company like GSA or GSA?
I'd be asking why, just because some deep thought into the sort of purpose and the desire is a good thing. And that may seem slightly odd because I didn't do that. It was more of an opportunistic thing and this emergence of this weird sector of like student accommodation, what's that? But just being true to yourself and giving a modicum of thought and consideration to the why. I then also think that, we don't employ robots. We employ people who really believe in what we do. Close-knit culture, atmosphere, working practices, the ability to keep going when the times are hard, and that kind of resilience, but also to have fun along the way. And so not just around the activity, but really being clear of the kind of personal values that are important to you and how you can align with, I guess, a sector, which is quite good fun and interesting, but also then with an organisation that has a shared belief with you as the individual, because that's only going to be a good thing. Let's face it, you get out of bed in the morning, you may have a pretty difficult day or week or month ahead of you. You've got to enjoy what you do and the people you work with, otherwise what's the point?
So we love to end our podcast on this final point, which is, if you could reinvent one aspect of real estate, what would that be?
I think the notion that there is a kind of centralised approach from a policy perspective that knows best as opposed to the market. And I know that the idea of free market forces can be controversial because leave the market, it will just concentrate on the kind of spreadsheet world, as I call it, of, the highest price stuff and blah, blah, blah. But let's face it, in competitive environments, that spurs people on to do better things and come up with better ideas and solutions than would otherwise exist, I would argue. And so giving more freedom to the industry to work stuff out, and it can't be the Wild West. There's got to be a degree of approach to that and some kind of guardrails. But talented people, giving them the fuel to do the right thing could be very different in terms of outcomes across all aspects of real estate, as long as it's approached in the right manner rather than people are just doing it for the wrong reasons and it's purely financial gain and so on. So it's got to be considered. But there's a bit of a missed opportunity, and hopefully that's a kind of theme I've touched on today, around being part of the solution, whatever that might be or needs to be, as opposed to there being friction in, real estate businesses and individuals and whatever going up against policymakers or going up against local residents or going up against people who are resistant to change per se or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's very much about that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So you have just watched or listened to episode 10 of Reinventing Real Estate with James Hunt from GSA, and this has been an incredibly interesting and informative podcast. I personally feel like I've learned so much about, the evolution of student accommodation, but also what it really means to challenge what you've been doing as a means for inspiring innovation in your sector and evolution within your business. So I'd highly recommend anyone who's interested in business development, student accommodation, the living sectors in general, or just, being inspired to tune into this episode. And you can listen to this on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, and also stay tuned for our next episode coming up soon. Thanks so much.